During that high anxiety period, you need monitoring, and you probably do need a health professional mediating the transfer of that information when it's associated with anxiety. And we can probably identify those tests that are going to provoke that kind of anxiety, because those are the broken gene tests. That's not going to be your risk of diabetes is 4% or 10% higher, or you've got odds ratio of 2 for glaucoma or something like that. That's not going to be in that category. That's going to be for the diseases we already know that this is pretty bad news, and let's deliver that through the medical model. And so I think we start from there, and we start from the space we've already carved out, and we don't give up all of that space to 23andMe. That does mean, however, think about it, it does mean when 23andMe introduces this service and says suddenly we're testing for the Ashkenazi Jewish mutations, laissez-faire may not be the right policy choice there, right? So it does have some, that prescription does have some grip. But that would be how I think about it. It would be a default that most stuff isn't going to fall in that category, but the stuff that's already in that category doesn't get to move out unless we've done some safety monitoring and we know that it's fairly safe to let it leak out. So, yes?
So that seems to create a bit of a policy challenge then.
Yeah.
When this is, I mean, presumably the companies anywhere in the world at the start, and you gave us lots of examples. If I had $1,000 to spend, I'm going to spend it at places that you get most information, rather than send it to the jurisdiction where that information is likely to be controlled.
So, and that's the really, so we are in a race here. And the race, just to clarify, thank you for that question, because it reminds me of a point I meant to make and I didn't. If you think about it, once we've gotten to the $5,000 genome, we're not very far from the $1,000 genome. And if you think almost all of the individual genetic tests that I'm talking about here, the cost for the first family member with BRCA in one of these families that's high risk, it costs about $3,000 to get that test from Myriad Genetics, $3,120. If you've got spinocerebellar ataxia, the first panel that you're going to get is going to cost $7,000 to get tested for it, because they're testing massive amounts of DNA, and it's expensive, and they're amplifying pieces of DNA and looking for, they're sequencing the whole stuff, right? Very, very slow and laborious. The thing is, when we've gotten to the $5,000 genome, testing for the whole genome is suddenly cheaper than testing for a single set of alleles that you're identifying. And when you've done that, you've got all of the information that I'm talking about, including the stuff that's high medical valence, as well as the more normal stuff. So we have to think about how we're going to, that, if you notice, that means that there does have to be a medical step involved in there. Because if any of that information is in this medical sphere, we can't just say you just send your DNA in and you get all of the results back. We can't do that.
I guess the challenge is who's the we in this? So if I have my $1,000, I'm not going to ask, respectfully, your opinion or whoever's controlling it. I'm going to send it to the person who's going to give me the most information.
So the we is, and when I'm saying we, I'm saying we have to go through a policy process of coming up with the rules. What I mean by the rules is laws and regulations. And the way that we're going, the only way really that you're going to, 23andMe is very serious about nothing between me and my genome. There have to be some things they cannot do. And there has to be something that says that. But we have to define what that is, and we have to define that pretty carefully. Yeah?
I think there's a great need for public education on the whole genome, because, I mean, a printout of your genome would only give you part of the story. So your genetics say that you're predisposed to certain illnesses, but it discounts completely any kind of environmental things that one might do to offset those. So where does that leave the person? I mean, I don't care whether I spend $100 or $1,000 on this, but if it's totally useless to me, what's the point? So what kind of consumer protection do you have there? I mean, it's a nice new toy, but what is it really going to do for you?
So this is what's really interesting about the transition that we're in. So these companies are doing the million common variations that we've already identified among human beings. If you think about it, it's kind of cool that we started there, because that's the least potent medical information. That's the least potent genomic information we could have started with. If you think about it, once you've got full genomic testing, then you've got not only the really, really bad news, but you've got all sorts of other stuff that you may not have thought about buried in that genomic information. If you want to play on the web, you're going to be able to figure out who your relatives are, which lineage you come from, and we are going to be able to have the lineages of every human population on the planet reconstructed by technical means, so that we're going to know which populations were related to which other populations, and which ones you're closest to and which you weren't. Sometimes that's going to be interesting to you, and sometimes it's going to be a surprise. But, you know, people thinking about the genome may not be thinking about that right now. They may be thinking ancestry testing, but they may not be thinking about, oh my gosh, that's kind of a big deal, isn't it? So we're going to be able to do stuff like that as soon as we've gone down to the full genomic sequence level. And the point of this is we're going to be there soon. I really do think we're talking about 5 years at most before we have to face these policy choices, because the technology, I think, is going to be there. So that's, I mean, you're right. Do we need education? And it's not just about medical stuff. It's not just interpreting this stuff. And the risk stuff. It's also all this ancestry. You're going to have people suddenly discovering, here's another scenario. You're going to be able to find, you're going to be able to get DNA sequence from almost anybody you want to if you take a hair. Or really it's going to be, so if you want to do something, the risk, the informed consent statement for the folks participating in the Personal Genome Project says, please go to this website and here are 16 horrible things that can happen to you if you've done that. One of those is somebody can take your sequence and put it at a crime scene and make it look like you committed a crime because they leave a piece of DNA sequence that was uniquely identified with you. How do they do that? Well, they synthesize that DNA and they put it at the crime scene. So they can frame you. Is that a new risk? Well, we didn't think about that probably too much. So all sorts of things like that. Paternity, who's related to whom, there are going to be surprises like that. People don't necessarily think about that before they opt into these things. You may discover, you're going to be able to, if you're an adopted person, you're going to be able to find all sorts of things about the sperm donor or your biological parents that they thought you weren't going to know when they became the anonymous at the very beginning of your life, when they gave you up as a baby. They didn't expect to be re-identified. You're going to have the technical means to break that privacy lock. All these things are going to be technically possible because of this one technology. That's why I think it is pretty serious, and we do have to be thinking about what the rules should be. So, yeah.
Just on the provision of information on genetic testing and so on, I think implicit in your presentation is that the medical profession is doing a pretty good job with the genetic testing, and of course they are generally, but there are certain indications that I'm more familiar with familial cancer sort of area where there are problems there as well. So for example, there seems to be a kind of a catastrophizing of genetic risk of cancer, that when you speak to cancer survivors, they then say, you know, it's not that bad. I'm overemphasizing, but other things like people may be familiar with the disease through their parents dying and so on. They haven't had it. So they have these kind of images of the disease that are quite different from how a lived reality of it would be. And then there's some studies that suggest that the information provision process is just not at all adequate. So, for example, one study where women underwent prophylactic oophorectomy without realizing that this would